Good evening. We're going to be starting in 5 minutes. If everyone can please take their seats.
Here, I'll go like right next to it, okay?
I'm just watching this.
Okay, if you could.
I don't speak it.
Congratulations. Very good.
If everyone could please take their seats, please. Good evening. Just a request, please, that people turn off their cell phones, put them on silent so we shouldn't have any disturbance. Welcome everyone to the Parenting Matters second lecture night series. I'd like to thank everyone for coming and joining us on this most important topic. I'd like to take a quick second to acknowledge the event sponsors tonight, Cross River Bank and Turo College, for understanding with the foresight and understanding the depth of the issues of today and partnering with us, recognizing that parenting is a struggle for all of us in one way or another. And it's so meaningful that we have such sponsors that understand this and want us to be able to learn and grow from it. We also have sponsors for the program, Torah Anytime and Bank United, Gotta Get a Bagel, Pip Printing, Seasons, and the 5towns.com. We're very appreciative for all your support and help in making this event tonight. No successful program works without a very successful staff. And I'd like to just take a minute to recognize some of the most wonderful staff members who have worked tirelessly putting this event together. And it took quite some time. I'd like to acknowledge and thank Mrs. Rivka Locke and Mrs. Sharon Gross. For all their tireless work and devotion. And this idea of this topic was really formulated by an individual who's now the clinical director at Madraigos, and we're very grateful to all her work on a daily basis with the tremendous crisis issues that we're dealing with, and also with the tremendous prevention and help with finding preventative ways to help families in our community, and that's Mrs. Mindy Woroblowski. Extremely proud of her efforts and her hard work. We have an ongoing parenting series of groups that go on a regular Monday night, and we're already up to our 5th group, and basically it's a group of parents that come together to share and be mechazik one another, and also to learn from professionals that could give them tremendous guidance and support. And not only is this formulated group go on for a few months and then it stops, but it continues going once a month in a representative's home. So we're very proud of that concept of not letting go, but continuously working with these families. And that is Mrs. Rena Kuttner and Mrs. Rifke Rosenwald. And we're very appreciative for all their mesiros nefesh, and hard work to help us, help our families, help our community grow and learn together. The actual parenting series and parenting work also has a big credit of the clinical directors of Madraigos that are not here anymore, but I want to acknowledge them and their service and their tremendous work is Mrs. Hani Delman and Mr. Eli Perlman. Madraigos has within it very wonderful and special therapists in our community that give of their time and their professional work to help the klal, and I want to recognize them that have been there and still on an ongoing basis, and they're usually the unsung heroes that are not acknowledged, and I want to take this opportunity to just list them by name. Mrs. Hani Delman, Mrs. Lani Schick, Mrs. Tali Arieff, Mr. Gabriel Fagan, Mr. Penny Farkas, Dr. Dov Finman, Mrs. Esther Goldstein, Dr. Deb Hirschhorn, Mrs. Rachel Lowinger, Mrs. Tali Moskowitz, Mrs. Randy Tanzer, Mr. Alexander Rand, Mrs. Chana Renov, and Dr. Devorah Rosenberg. This evening is dedicated Lulei Nishmas, firstly Rabbi Beryl Wine's wife that recently passed away, Soret Zipporah Miral Alel Shalom Bas Harav Baruch Halevi, and also for Dr. Pelkowitz's father, Zerchenu Tzaddik Levracha, that just passed away, Harav Rafael ben Harav Ephraim. The neshamos should have an aliyah. The theme of tonight is parenting then and now. And I think that's one of the most common questions that we hear in the office. Why is it that things changed? My parents didn't have to do that. We never seen that before. Why are things changing? Why is it necessary to come up with new concepts and new ideas? And the truth of the matter is, it's not clear, and it's not so simple. And there's not just one easy answer, especially when it comes to something as our children, parenting our children. What more of an important task do we have in this world than to give our children the hadracha, the education, the responsibility? So we wanted to go very far and very deep to the absolute two people that could give us this perspective of then and now. Before I introduce our first speaker, Rabbi Wine, I just want to Rabbi Krupka is here. If you could just join us, I'd like to say a Perek Tehillim for some of the cholim that are in our community and around, and there's a lot of tzaras going on, and I think it might be a tremendous chus for the community cholim if we could just say a quick Perek Tehillim. I'm sorry I didn't ask you beforehand, but if that's okay. That's great.
If you could please stand and join me. Pasuk b'pasuk. Shir HaMalos, Mimama Kim Krosicha Adonai. Adonai Shema v'koili, Tiyen oznecha kashuvois l'kol tachnunoi. Im avonos tishmor yo, Adonai miyamod. כי עמך הסליחה למען תבורך. כי ויסי אדוני כבשון נפשי ולדברי יכולתי. נפשי לאדוני משומרים לבוקר, שומרים לבוקר. יחל ישראל אל אדוני, כי אם אדוני החסד והרבה עמו יפדוס. והוא יפדס ישראל מכל עוונותיו. משברך אבותינו אברהם, יצחק ויעקב, משה ודוד ושלמה יבורך וירפא את החולים הנזכרים פה בשכונה זו. שכולנו מספלים בעבורם, בסחזי הקדוש ברוך הוא ימלא רחם עליהם, להחלימם, להפויסם, להחזיקם, להחיוסם. וישלח להם מהר רפואה שלמה ונשמיים לרמח ואיבריהם ושסר גידיהם בסך שאר חולי ישראל. רפואת הנפש ורפואת הגוף, השתה בכל זמן קריב ונאמר אמן.
I had asked the staff if they could please print out for me the tremendous bio of Rabbi Wein, and I honestly, it was so impressive and so much that I think that just by me saying that, I was just so overwhelmed and so inspired that it's really incredible. And the pasuk says in Dvarim, in the Shiras Hazinu, says, Shal avicha v'yagetcha zekeinecha v'yoimru lach, that we really have a responsibility to know what happened and what took place. And Rabbi Wein is the pioneer of that. And for us to understand what to do today, we need to know what happened before and what. And Sha'al zekeinecha, Rashi, on the Sifsei Chachamim, Rashi says that these are the Chachamim, the wise men that could tell us and give us direction and give us a path, because if you don't know where you came from, it's very difficult to know where to go. So it's a great zchus for us, a tremendous honor, to call upon Rabbi Wein to address us this evening.
Thank you very much. Good evening. I noticed that Madraigos provided a notebook here for Dr. Pelkowitz and myself, and it says, Parenting Matters. And it's a substantial notebook. The only thing is that every page is blank. So I think that part of my task is at least to fill out one of the blank pages as to what once was. Now, I'm not a believer in the good old days, because the good old days weren't so good. There's a sense of nostalgia always regarding the past. The errors are forgotten, the weaknesses are forgiven, and our memory chooses to remember what we positively wish to remember. Nevertheless, there is no question, at least to me, as I view my grandchildren trying to raise my great-grandchildren. You know, they look at me in awe. One of them said to me over Pesach, Elter Zaidi, how come you look so old? And I said, ask your parents. There's no question to me that it's much harder today. And the reasons for it are many, a few of which I wish to discuss. I was born, basically, my childhood was at the end of the Great Depression in the United States and of the Second World War. And my adolescence was of the period after the Second World War, when the survivors came and when the State of Israel was created. Those were seminal events in the lives of people who lived then. You could not escape them. In fact, as a child, I remember that one of the first words that I could repeat in English was the word affidavit, because my parents were struggling to obtain affidavits to try and bring my uncle and aunt and cousins from Lithuania to the United States, which they were not successful in doing. And I grew up at a time, I went to public school till 7th grade. There was no Jewish school in Chicago. But when you went to public school in my day, there was a separate entrance for boys and for girls, from kindergarten onwards. And the culture of the school, which was basically Protestant religion, was not antithetical to much of the culture that existed in our home and in our neighborhood, which was 100% Jewish at that time. And therefore, people did not feel that there was a clash between the public school and between the home, or between the general society and the Jewish society. Now, this had very negative implications as well, because it led to assimilation. It led to the confusion that somehow the general culture was our culture, that their goals were our goals. But on the other hand, it made it much more easy, to use a word, to raise a child, because there was discipline in the school, because of the fact that the value system that was taught in the school was fairly identical to the value system of Jewish tradition and of the Jewish home. And that was an enormous difference between then and now, because now one can hardly think of exposing one's child to the general culture, which to a certain extent is self-destructive in the extreme. When I grew up, believe it or not, Jews did not have money. And when I mean did not have money, I meant they did not have money. And no one dreamt of vacations, trips. If you got a hat and a tie for your bar mitzvah, you wore it to your wedding, because there was no second one. People simply didn't have. And the struggle of the Jewish parent then was that my child should have what I don't have. And the tragedy of that generation was that in trying to give their children what they did not have, they neglected to give their children what they did have. So everyone immediately, from the time you were a child onwards, you had to plan out your future. Because no one was going to support you. No one could support you. The reason that people credit the existence of Kolalim in America as though that were the great educational discovery, Kolalim came because there was money. When there was no money, there couldn't be a kollel, no matter how devoted you were to the cause of Torah study. So that was one major difference. And we grew up and knew that there was no money, and therefore we had limited expectations. I never expected to own a home. I never expected even to drive an automobile of my own, because my parents didn't, and nobody else's parents did either. There were exceptions. But the basic Jewish world, certainly in Chicago where I grew up, we all had very limited expectations. And we all expected that we would have to make our way by ourselves. And that was a mindset. And that mindset was the discipline that our parents did not have to enforce upon us. No one had to tell you, do your homework. Because you knew if you didn't do your homework, you weren't going to get a good mark. If you didn't get a good mark, you weren't going to get into school. You weren't going to be able to go to university. You wouldn't have a chance to someday own a home or drive an automobile. So that's an enormous difference. Because today's world is a world of affluence. Never in the history of the Jewish people, to my knowledge, and I'm never wrong, has the Jewish people as a whole possessed the wealth that it possesses today. The material comforts, the ability to enjoy life, which is so ironic because very few people do enjoy life. In a world of affluence, the challenge is far different than a world of poverty. Chazal say, the Gemara says, Yoeh an Yusol Yisrael. The Jewish people do better when they are poor than when they are wealthy. And to a great extent, that is the problem that we are dealing with. Now, I don't preach poverty, God forbid. I don't want to go back to that time. When my colleagues and I in the yeshiva started to search for a mate and to start to go out, so 5 of us geniuses pooled our resources to buy one good tie. And we would arrange our social life so the tie would be available. And it was a Countess Mara tie, it was $25 then, wow. It was as ugly as could be, but my chavrusa, I remember one Sunday morning, we had a chavrusa at 6 in the morning to learn, and I knew he had gone out with this girl the night before, and he was very interested in her. And when he came to learn in the morning, I saw he was slightly depressed. And I said to him, well, what's wrong? What happened? And he said, she told me she went out with this tie once before. That doesn't happen today. That does not happen today. And that's a major, major difference in background. Another difference is that today in the United States, in the main, it's very acceptable to be a Jew. You can be a nominee for vice president and be a Sabbath observer. You can be a Jew. You can aspire to anything, which again is a great contribution, but on the other hand is fraught with all sorts of dangers. In my time, in past generations, here in the United States, I'm not talking about Europe, I was born in Chicago. America never had official anti-Semitism as the European countries have had. But America had, and to a certain extent still has, social, political, economic anti-Semitism. And because of that, therefore, to a great extent, to put it not so nicely, we all knew our place. We did not expect that somehow we would ever run for vice president. We did not expect that somehow a Jew would be the chairman of DuPont Chemical. We didn't expect that Jews would be as publicly wealthy and influential and political as the current generation is. And that also is part of the challenge. Most of American Jewry has failed on that challenge. Absolutely failed. Because of the fact that the general culture has become their culture. And the general value system has become their value system. And what Torah has to say, whose Torah, what Torah, where Torah? The people of the book don't know what book you're talking about. That was not true in my time. But as society changed, when I saw it already in the 60s and the 70s, as society changed and the Jewish attitudes changed, that situation also began to change. And then there was a question of education. In the 1940s, the day school movement was begun. I remember in Chicago, I had just finished 6th grade in the public school. And they opened up a junior high school. Then it was called the Chicago Jewish Academy. It was co-ed. My classmate next to me was the Novominsker Rebbitzin. And neither she or I would admit to it publicly. And the school never charged tuition. I remember that Rabbi Sachs, Zechrona Lavrocha, who was one of the founders of the school, would go to homes, and he didn't go, most homes were not Sabbath observant. They were Jewish, but not Sabbath observant. They had to work on Saturday. And he would say, in the words of the Chumash, Tein li hanefesh, give me the child, don't worry about paying, you don't have to pay. I went through 12 years in the yeshiva without ever paying a nickel in tuition. There were Balabatim in Chicago that somehow paid for it. It was a different attitude. The attitude was somehow we have to save the Jewish people. The only way to save the Jewish people is to save Jewish children. The only way to save Jewish children is to give them a Jewish education. And the rabbis in Chicago, my father included, spent a majority of their time raising funds for the Jewish schools so that Jewish children would have a Jewish education. Now, I'm not here to discuss the tuition crisis, but it is a crisis. It's way out of hand. It's not what again, I can't speak for God. Other rabbis can, but I can't. But I don't think that that's what the Torah had in mind. So it was a different attitude. It was also an attitude that you were willing, not only willing, you were absolutely convinced that you would take in any Jewish child and do the best that you can with each and every one of them. And that was a world we didn't know from all of the things that go on today. And again, I'm not saying that was right, but I'm just filling in the page. In all my years in school, I never knew anyone that was ADD, but there must have been a lot of them. Generally, the attitude was the teacher was right. The Rebbe was right. The parent would never take the side of the student. I'm not saying that that's correct, but you did not have the interference which exists today in the school system of parents, of donors. See, I can say all of this because I'm going to Jerusalem Tuesday. But I think it should be said. We're victims of our own success. We've corrupted ourselves. And therefore, that attitude existed. And that attitude immediately fostered a certain discipline in the students, because they knew that no one was going to come and back them up. And we got a very good education. Looking back at it, we had a wonderful education. We used to, when I was in 10th grade, we learned 50 Blat Gemara in Ksubis Be'iyun, from Sukkot to Pesach. And we thought that's the way it's supposed to be, because the Rebbe demanded that of us. The Rebbe was a wonderful person. But no one sets such goals today, and if they do, they are rarely realized. So it was maybe it's a bubble in history. Now, there always were problems, there always were people at risk. We didn't have 100% success in the yeshiva. We didn't have 100% success anywhere. But generally speaking, those that chose to hang on were able to hang on. Most chose not to hang on. My father's shul in Chicago was a big shul on the west side, so they had 2 minyanim on Shabbos morning. They had the Hashkoma minyan, so there were 750 men that attended that minyan. And then they had the regular minyan, another 750 men at 9 o'clock. So as a child, I used to go with my father to the 9 o'clock minyan. Once, I saw all of these other men leaving the shul from the first minyan. And I said to my father, "Daddy, what happened? Who were they?" Because I was unaware. My father did answer me. Only later in life, I discovered that the first minyan, today the Hashkama minyan is where God prays. But then the Hashkoma minyan was, if you were going to work on Saturday, and you had to take the trolley to work, but you wanted to daven, so you went to the Hashkoma minyan, you went out from shul, then you took the trolley and you went to work. Most of those Jews lost their children because somehow that couldn't be navigated. They did not produce another generation of Hashkoma minyan of that ilk or form. But that was what was involved. And there was one other major difference. I spoke about anti-Semitism. I mean, on the street, the non-Jews would call you names, or they would beat you up. And that was expected. You didn't expect to go through life without being called a kike. And therefore, to a certain sense, it built up a defense mechanism within you. And the defense mechanism was, I have something that they don't have. And it gave a great sense of Jewish self-identity, which today doesn't exist. And the major difference was the creation of the State of Israel. In 1946, when the refugees began to trickle into Chicago, I remember Rabbi Oshri came to our home to tell my father how his brother and his wife and their little children were executed publicly by the communists in 1940 in Lithuania for being counter-revolutionaries. Every house had casualties. Everybody lost somebody. The Holocaust was not a museum. It was personal. It was real. And we didn't have to say never again because we believed it could happen again. And the shaykhs that threw a stone at me, if you gave him a gun, who knows? That was our mindset. And then along came the State of Israel with all of the miracles and ups and downs and unbelievable story. And it reinvigorated us. When I was in public school, the shkotzim used to holler at me, "Go back to Palestine." So we were the Palestinians. I don't know how we lost that title along the way. But it gave us backbone. After the 6-Day War, you could wear a yarmulke in the street. state of Israel allowed us to raise children in an openly Jewish fashion. And it became a focal point of our lives. And when I went to public school, there was a patriotic statement regarding the United States, something which today you're almost embarrassed to say, my country, right or wrong, my country. Today, my country better be right, according to my standards, otherwise it's not my country. So Israel's not my country. It's socialist or it's not socialist. It's religious, it's not religious. It's belligerent, it's not belligerent. It's not my country. And children sense that. And all of the flags and programs, as wonderful as they are, cannot change that inner feeling. The inner feeling that Eastern European Jews had regarding Eretz Yisrael and regarding the Jewish people. I remember that on May 14th, 1948, Friday night, when I walked with my father to shul, and my father, who was not an especially emotional person publicly, is the quintessential Lithuanian Talmud Chacham. He wept every step of the way. I was amazed. What is he crying about? But he was crying about the whole 2,000 years, about what it means to be a Jew, about how somehow something has happened that should not have happened, that no one figured would have happened, and that we live to see it and be part of it. I don't know how to communicate that feeling to another generation. I have tried. And in my old age, I have started to cry. We live in a time when tears are rare, and where the feeling of Jewish solidarity is always open to question. So that changed. All of this has changed. And I told Dr. Pelkovitz that I think it's much harder today than it was in my time, even though in my time they were terribly unsuccessful. The Jewish world disappeared. The Navi says, B'sa'os b'nei Yisrael me'olai. And the Jewish people made a grave error and they lost their way. Most of American Jewry lost their way. But it was a different society. So simply knowing that it was a different society, I think, helps. It fills in a page. It gives us perspective. It allows us to realize where we were, and therefore perhaps where we are, but more importantly, perhaps where we should be. You know, they say a rabbi has 3 speeches: the one he prepared, the one he delivered, the one he should have delivered. But we have to know what happened. We have to know what the situation is now, and perhaps we'll come to a realization of what can be done to face the challenges and to continue the growth and success of the Jewish people. The Lord promised us that we would survive. The Lord promised us that Torah would survive. The Lord promised us that we would return to the land of Israel. The Lord's promises are all valid. but they require human cooperation and effort and work and sacrifice. And to the extent that we are there, then the challenges of today, as enormous as they are, will be met like all of the challenges in Jewish history. And we'll be privileged together to see generations of Jewish children, oskim b'Torah v'mitzvahs, great and good people with a value system, with a moral compass, and with a great and eternal future. Thank you.
Well, we asked a question, and boy, did we get an answer. I think right before I call upon Dr. Polkovitz, there's a parent here that's been coming to our parenting group that we'd like to ask her to come forward for just a few minutes to discuss some of her feedback from the parenting group.
Good evening. Madraigos is well known throughout the Far Rockaway Five Towns community and beyond for its many vital programs and services that it provides for young people and their families. When people think of Madraigos, what usually comes to mind is services such as community education, case management, crisis intervention, holiday programs, and the lounge. There's much more to Madraigos, though. Tonight, I would like to share how one of Madraigos' hidden gems impacted myself and my family in a profound and lasting way. My husband and I turned to Madraigos for help at a very low point in our relationship with one of our children. I will freely admit that I made many mistakes in my interactions with my son, and I was in dire need of support and guidance. In addition to individual support, the staff at Madraigos suggested that we participate in the parenting support group that they offer. I was somewhat unsure of what to expect at the group. Would it be difficult to open up to a group of strangers? How would it work? Would it be awkward? But I can unequivocally say that the parenting support group, led by Rena Kuttner and Rivki Rosenwald, was life-changing. From the moment that my husband and I entered the room, Rena and Rivki helped us feel extremely comfortable and immediately able to overcome any initial reticence or hesitation that we had. My husband and I felt that we were in a safe, warm, accepting space where we could honestly voice our fears and our concerns, as well as our hopes and our dreams, where we felt validated and understood. Rivki and Rena were simultaneously incredibly supportive, and yet they challenged our previously held beliefs and ideas. In a gentle yet firm way, they pushed us to grow and to change as parents and as individuals. They gave us the inner calm, serenity, and strength to be able to persevere and face our challenges. They gave us the tremendous gift of skills and tools for an entirely new philosophy and way of approaching our parenting. The members of our parenting group were from diverse and varying segments of our community. Different schools and different neighborhoods, different ages and stages of parenting. Some of us had children with emotional challenges, some with educational struggles, some with religious issues, some who struggled with substance abuse, and some who just had regular, typical children. But we all faced our own unique and different challenges in raising our children. Yet, we all shared the common goals of a desire to create a loving relationship with our children, and to raise healthy and productive children who bring nachas to their families and to Hashem. The parenting group brought us together and allowed us to share our perspectives and experiences with each other in a profoundly supportive way. In an atmosphere of trust and without judgment, friendships formed, and we developed into a cohesive unit that was a source of mutual support and help, support which has continued even after the formal parenting group concluded. I truly believe that every parent, at any stage and in any situation, and even without facing any particular challenges, would benefit tremendously from the skills and parenting approach that we learned in the parenting group. Everyone, mechanchim, rabbanim, teachers, mental health professionals, emphasizes how the most important thing as a parent, especially when faced with challenges, is to create and maintain a good relationship with your children. And I so very much wanted this for my family. But until we began participating in the parenting group, I didn't know how to do that in practice. Rena and Rifki taught us how to be the heroic parents that all of our children need. The insights and the skills that we learned in the parenting group have had a tremendously positive impact, not just on our relationship with our son, but on our relationship with all of our children, and on creating a loving and harmonious atmosphere in our home. To us, the Madraigos parenting group was a lifeline. Thank you, Madraigos, and Rena and Rifki individually, for giving me back my relationship with my son and with all of my children. We will forever be grateful to you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to call upon Dr. Pelkovitz. Obviously, in this community and throughout all our communities, he does not need an introduction, but I'd like to consider, like I consider Rabbi Wein the rabbi's rabbi, I consider Dr. Pelkovitz the doctor's doctor. So without further ado, I'll call upon Dr. Pelkovitz.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And just make sure I have my glasses. Okay. Okay. I already started filling in Rabbi Wein's book, because it's so valuable to hear his perspective. Has me thinking about things I hadn't thought about. And to the extent that part of tonight is in memory of my father, I'm going to just start in a practical way, sharing with you 3 lessons I learned about parenting from my father, and then I'll get into the heart of recommendations. Number 1 was, what is it that we know, the Hebrew word ashrei, the highest level of happiness, is tied to the word ishur, to license or validate. And in his interactions with each of his children, he knew how to recognize our uniqueness. He knew how to recognize the uniqueness and validate us to the extent that we were all extremely different, even though we shared the same values. Now, the research shows the longer siblings live under the same roof, the more different they become from one another. It's pretty amazing, right? My oldest son, Ari, told me that at one point my father held on to him by his shoulders and looked him in the eye and said, "Ari, just be Ari." And it was an amazing affirmation of Ari, who's a remarkable boy who marched to the beat of a different drum and became a remarkable adult, but was always completely accepted by my father, who set the stage for us to be able to take in the diversity of the uniqueness of each of our children. You know, my father would often quote the beautiful Rav Yerucham on the brachas of Yaakov to each of his children, where it says, Ish asher kfi berchaso beirachosam. And what Rav Yerucham brings down there beautifully, as I've told some of you in the past, is that if when you give a bracha to your children, whether or not you have the minhag of actually benching your children Friday night, but if when you fantasize about your children and what you want them to become, if your thoughts are about what you want them to achieve that you never achieved yourself. You can never be a doctor, you want them to be a doctor. You can never be a full Talmud Chacham, they're going to do it for you. He said, if your bracha and your wishes and your dreams and aspirations that you pour into your children are about what you dream about for yourself, he says, you know what it's like? He says, it's like taking a watering can and watering a piece of earth that has no seeds in it. He says it's literally a bracha levatala. It's an exercise in futility. If you want a bracha to take hold, if you want your wishes for your children to take hold, it has to be a match for their aspirations. It has to be a match for the essence of who they are. And it has to be in the context of a clear balance between love and limits. The ability to not just always be there hugging them, but the ability to also have the small doche, to be able to gently push them away in the context of love. My father had the ability to do that. He often said no, but it was always in the context of saying yes far more often, and we knew we were on the same team. I once had a woman from this neighborhood come to me, and she said, I always wondered why my son, who's on the hockey team in one of the local yeshivos here, he says, I always wonder, why is it that the coach always works him incredibly hard? If he does the slightest thing wrong, he'll have to do, dozens and dozens of push-ups or run countless laps. And he totally accepts it. But if I even look at him sideways, he has a tantrum on me. And then she said, one night, I woke up in the middle of the night with this deep insight, which is I realize it's because with the coach, he realizes that we're all on the same team. With my father, we were always on the same team. So that's that validation, recognizing the uniqueness in the context of also being able to say no. The key to uniqueness is, again, something that my father and I always very much enjoyed and wrote about in one of our books, is that beautiful Rav Kook, which I think is something I always aspire to. It's extremely hard, but you've heard it, but let's review it. Yesh ben chorin sherucho ruach shel eved. There are free men who have a spirit of a slave. V'yesh eved sherucho malei acheros. And there are slaves who have a spirit filled with freedom. Here's what Rav Kook said, and this is what I think we all have to aspire in raising our children. Hanemon la'atzmiyuso ben chorinhu. If you figure out a way to raise your children and to educate your children, and even in terms of modeling for them, to be neman la'atzmiyuso, to be faithful to your inner essence, you'll always be free. And here's the real challenge. I still often have to think about this. And somebody whose entire life is just about, what do other people want? How do I impress this person or that person? Whoever. That person will always be a slave. I know some people who are profoundly wealthy and successful people who I've seen over a number of years, and they have multiple homes, and they have more than enough money to last them for 20 lifetimes, and they're slaves. And I know people who never quite know where the next meal is going to come from, and they're free men, and they're free women. So that's point one. Point two was a certain flexibility, a certain openness. Rabbi Wein spoke so beautifully about the exposure to the outside world, about his, about the woman sitting next to him, Rebbetzin Perlau, who now I understand her better, because she was a very open-minded and phenomenally, my mother here knew her also very well, right, Rebbetzin Perlau? She was pretty remarkable woman, but I guess that's what the Chicago yeshiva education will do for you. I went to, after going to High, now Hafter, I went to Masifta of Long Beach, their first class, and then to Torah Vodaas. So by the time I finished learning in Torah Vodaas, Beis Medrash with Rav Palm and Rav Gedalia Shore for a number of years, all the highlight was squeezed out of me. And then I was just thinking about it today. I wanted to become a clinical psychologist, and I applied to Penn. Didn't even enter my mind to ask for permission to do it. And this was in the early 70s. This is a long time ago. This is when there was campus unrest. This is when the world was gone wild. And I was accepted into, the Penn Clinical Psych doctoral program. And it wasn't even a question that my parents, my father and mother, Aleim Shalom, they totally supported it. And then I only realized that was unusual when my friends who wanted to go to school out of town, who had a similar background to me, they couldn't believe that my parents said yes to it. And there was that belief in us. It really is such an important part of parenting. After you've done your job and you've poured your heart and your soul and your worry, remember that gematria, Ava and Daiga is the same gematria, right? Love and worry are inextricably intertwined. You have to believe in your kid. A study I've been telling people lately, and I guess I'm weaving in my speech into these thoughts about my father, is a beautiful thought, a beautiful study done by Dr. Ellen Langer at Harvard. She takes a group of men who were old, men in their 80s and beyond, and she has them spend 5 days in a converted monastery. It's a monastery outside of Boston that was made to look exactly like the world looked to these men when they were in their prime at age 40. And each of the men were told when they came into the monastery for that 5 days, the former monastery, they were told, treat each other like you're 40 years old. Occupy the headspace of a 40-year-old. They didn't help them with their bags. They would have to carry their bags up, even if it was one shirt at a time, 3 flights of steps. And they spent a whole week thinking and living the life of younger men. Phenomenal things happened after those 5 days relative to the comparison group that spent the next week in the same monastery and were treated like old men. Among the changes that took place was not only that their mood improved, but their strength improved. A team of ophthalmologists, not knowing which group these men were in, found every one of the men to have their vision significantly improved. They saw more. There's an interesting association with the Gemara on what broader perspectives come with optimism and joy and maybe believing in yourself. They were told to believe in each other and each other's youth. By the way, the wallpaper was the wallpaper, the way it looked when these men were 40. Black and white televisions, the art, it was the whole thing. But here's my favorite part of the story, of the study. Not only did they become younger in multiple ways because of this belief in each other and themselves, but a newspaper reporter who covered the study, which was replicated in England with even more phenomenal results, reported that as they were waiting for the bus to take them back to Boston, they spontaneously started a game of two-hand touch football. This is a true secret. I'm telling you, it's there. I'll show it to you if you ask me. So again, there's that part of believing, a belief. I'll just end this with the Tiferes Yisrael, the beautiful Tiferes Yisrael and Avos and Havigola L'Makom Torah. Here's what he says. He says, if you always stay surrounded in the same Daled Amos that you grew up in, and you never test yourself by leaving your zone of comfort, you'll never grow. you'll never grow. He says, in order to master Torah, in order to internalize the values of your parents and the values of your rebellion, Tiferes Yisrael says, you have to go away from the comfort of home. You have to push yourself. As Chazal tell us, Ein Adam Omed al Divrei Torah Elam Kein Nichshal Bahem. And the final point I want to make before I move on to some specific recommendations is research tells us that values are very much transmitted not just by knowledge. There's a big difference between moral knowledge and moral action. Values are transmitted by what do we as parents and grandparents focus on? What do we spend time on? What do we get emotional about? That's the core. That's the key. And I'll just share with you, before I move on to the next section, a story about my parents. I went to Camp Monk as a little kid for a certain number of years. It was a camp, that wonderful camp. It glorified the way to be a hero in Camp Monk, other than to really enjoy Tisha B'Av. They did Tisha B'Av in a way that was amazing. It was basically, at least the way as a kid there, I felt you could only really feel terrific about your experience there if you were a terrific athlete. It's not what they stood for. They were an amazingly frum and educationally brilliant camp, but you had to be a good athlete. And there were all kinds of awards they'd give at the end of the year for best in baseball, best monkrabat, if you were very good at that kind of thing, and all kinds of things in terms of athletic awards. Then there was what I always saw as the loser award. The loser award was the award I invariably got as a major klutz. It was best midos. And I was incredibly embarrassed by the Midos Award. And I would take it and I would bury it in the bottom of my trunk. And I'd come back and my mother and father, Aleim Hashem, would look at me and say, so, well, David, get any awards? He said, no, they canceled awards this year. No awards whatsoever. And I remember my mother, who was very wise in the way she did it, she'd go through the trunk and she'd find the Best Midos Award. I remember this ritual happened a number of times. They would call me into a room, and with tears in their eyes, they would say, David, this is what we dream for you. Do you think we care what kind of ball player you are? Do you think we could care if you could sink a basket? Do you think that means anything to us? This is all that matters. It's that you be a mensch, that you be honest, that you be kind, that you be empathic. And you know what? When you repeat something, but it's also the tears, it's also the emotion, that's the way to instill values. You have to believe it in your core. Let's move on to a couple of core points I want to make. Okay, let's see. Interesting. Okay, I'll make it up. Okay, here goes. Okay, you're going to get a slightly different speech. Right. Okay, it's good. It's probably better. Okay? Okay. Actually, you know what? That'll get me to my next point, my first point. My first point in terms of what I want to focus on is a little bit on the importance, I think one of the greatest challenges of today. What is it that we see as psychologists, as social workers, as therapists in the field, as parenting experts? What do we see that's a big difference? And it's something that we know, that for the last 20 to 30 years, in the balance between love and limits, parents have been amazing in terms of being love specialists. Not as good in setting limits, not as good in saying no. So I want to talk about some practical recommendations on how to say no. So I want to develop that a little bit. And how do you handle your kids' upset? How do you handle your kids' upset? So I want to talk about that a little bit. But first I want to talk about the power of being able to have your child view frustration as a source of growth. Because if that could change your mindset, it would make a little bit of it would make a difference. So I'm going to tell you the story of Keith Jarrett. It's a terrific story. You could Google it at some point, not right now, but it's the story of Keith Jarrett. This is the story of what happened. He was a world Jarrett. You know about this? Jarett. Keith Jarrett. He was a world-renowned jazz pianist, jazz musician. He was like the leading guy. And in 1975, he was set to play a major concert in Cologne, Germany. 6,000 seats, they were all sold out way before. He gets to the concert hall early in the morning to make sure that the piano is ready and to start his rehearsal. And for some reason, I don't understand to this day, an 18-year-old girl, or I think an 18-year-old girl, was put in charge of preparing the piano. And she, I don't know how this happened, but she had a piano there that was totally unusable. All of the keys on the left side, there were no pads. So no matter how hard you press down, no sound. All the keys on the right side, no sound. Okay? The only thing that worked was the middle keys, but only if you really pushed down on them as hard as you could, and then you'd get a sort of out of tune kind of thing going. So he turns to her, he says, "You have to get me another piano. I can't do it. Can't do it. This is not a usable piano." And she calls all over Europe. You can't get a concert-level piano on such short notice. So he tells her, okay, we have to cancel the concert. And being an adolescent, she does what you'd expect an adolescent would do when faced with public humiliation. She had a total meltdown. She throws herself on the ground. She says she's going to kill herself, and she's gone. And he's a soft touch. He's a nice guy, Keith Jarrett. And finally he says, okay, I'll give it a shot. And he goes on to perform what has gone on to be the best-selling jazz piano concert in history. You could buy it. Just Google Keith Jarrett, Cologne, Germany, 1975. It's haunting. It's haunting. You hear him huffing and puffing, but the total impossibility of the task, the total challenge, brought out a level of creativity and greatness in him that made him an even greater and more admired musician than he was before. Again, as I said before, Ein Adam Omed al Divrei Torah Elam Kein Nichshal Behem. The greatest gift we could give to our kids is to let them mess up, to go back to the wisdom of the era that my father grew up in, and a little later that Rabbi Wein, that Rabbi Dr. Wein grew up in, the era where you don't go to bat for your kids all the time. You know, maybe the teacher is right, and even if the teacher isn't right, you let them face some difficulty. You let them be upset. You know, the wisdom of Chazal, listen to this medrash. I've quoted it to some of you before. In Mishlei, it says, Yaser bincha ki yesh tikva vel hamiso al titei nefshecha. Put limits on your kids, there's always hope, and don't pay attention to their yelling and screaming and crying. So this amazing medrash on this says, Kol hamosif av yisurim al beno, mosif haben ahava al avid. And boy, is that true. The more a father or a mother puts limits on their child, the more that child will love the parent. I see it all the time in my office. Kids who, when they were in my office many years ago, I've been practicing now for 40 years in this area, in the North Shore. And so I'm now well into multiple generations. And there have been a number of times where I've had kids who, when their parents said no, went crazy and had tantrums on the floor of my office. And then, now, they have their own teenage kids that they're bringing to me. It's even getting to be into a generation beyond. It's a pretty amazing thing. And multiple times they've told me the same thing. They say, you know, Doc, remember when I was in this office and I was having tantrums and I was going crazy when my parents said no? Remember how violent I was? Remember how I screamed and I cried and I went nuts? He said, even then, I was happy that they said no. Okay? And then they come to me with their kid. And something that they'll often tell me also is, why did my parents, this is with other parents, why did they let me do the things they let me do? You know how many kids come back from studying in Eretz Yisrael saying, why was I allowed to go out into the city on Motzei Shabbos? Why was I allowed to be unsupervised for this? And then in a fascinating study by my colleague Debbie Fox in Los Angeles, she found something amazing. She was looking at digital challenges. And one of the things that she found with digital challenges is that there's a very clear finding on the part of these kids that they say that they wish their parents were stricter with them or had more rules for them online. We have Dr. Ellie Shapiro here, who's done amazing research on this on very large numbers. So I don't want to quote anything wrong, but I'll just quote one of the findings that Debbie had. Debbie asked the kids a great question. When you have teenagers of your own, how are you going to handle the internet differently than your parents handled it with you? And more than half the kids said, I'm going to be stricter. I'm going to be stricter. They'd say, I saw that they wrote things like, if I could only get those images out of my head that I saw at a young age that I never should have seen. If I could only get those hours back that I squandered, being up to 2, 3 in the morning, texting friends, being on social media with friends, talking to them about such incredibly important questions they'd have for me are, you asleep yet? You up yet? What's up? You know? They said, if I could only get that back. And there's real remorse. There's real remorse. So just remember that when you put limits on, and I'll give you some specific recommendations on limits in a few minutes. Okay, let's go to the next thing over here. Okay. Number 1. I found it. Okay. So, do you know that along the lines of the need for the small docha, in a longitudinal study done at Harvard, there's a finding, this is the one that looked at kids, it's the longest going longitudinal study ever done. In the original cohort, the future President Kennedy was there, a number of Nobel laureates, and they follow these people into adulthood and they see what's associated with success and what's associated with vulnerability. You know what one of the most important things in terms of being associated with success? It's chores. We don't talk about that enough. Give your children chores. It's not child abuse to have them make their bed in the morning. And it's not at all unreasonable to have them clean up or take the garbage out or whatever. Many of you may do it. But I was at a neighborhood last year in a different part of the country, and I mentioned this. And I talked to the heads of a school and the heads of a couple of shuls in a talk like this. And one of the shul that I was going to be speaking in that Shabbos, the Rav talked about this chores thing, and he talked to the kids, and he said, we've always had help in cleaning up Kiddush. Kids, we'd like you to clean up Kiddush. And they loved it. I don't know how long it went on. They loved cleaning up Kiddush. It gave them a sense of efficacy, a sense of responsibility. And then one of them was told, this is the guy who told us to do it. There was a blizzard there. I chose the wrong time to go to that part of the world. And they cleaned off without being asked. The whole group of them went outside and they cleaned off my car. Without being asked. When we tap into that, when we tap into the chesed of our children and their need to not always be protected, it can make an enormous kind of difference. Okay, next. Wanted to just go on to some specific kinds of recommendations in terms of how to say no. How to say no. So, the first, I'm going to read you something I came across in preparing this, and it was something I don't even know where it came from, but this is actually a direct dictation from my father. I don't think it made it into our books, but it came up, so I figure I have to read this. And it's good, about the power of sometimes saying no without an explanation. Here's direct quote. The story illustrating this point about sometimes you say no without an explanation is told about a generous, spirited man who was hounded by numerous acquaintances who would constantly ask him for favors. One man in particular repeatedly took advantage of his kind personality. Upon receiving a letter, once again asking him to send him money, he wrote back a letter saying, in quotes, "In response to your request for another loan, my answer is no. And in order that you know that my answer is final, I give you no reason." A lot of wisdom in that story. And that's basically this set of recommendations for handling saying no, okay? So number one is it's the broken record technique. That's ages me. You remember records, right, Rabbi? Yeah. Nobody else here knows. A record used to be this round disc that would play music. But the broken record, they used to get stuck. But now we'd call it a broken MP3, but they don't break. So ask your grandparents about what a record was, okay? So here's the I know you know what a record is. So broken record technique is basically if a kid keeps at you with negative persistence. Number one, meaning that you say no, and they keep lawyering you, and they're going after you over and over and over again, and you want to kill them. Okay, does this happen to some of you? You're all nodding your head about your neighbors, I know that, okay? So here's what the recommendation is on that. The recommendation is that you tell them once with a good explanation. Here's why. They want to go out, it's a school night, and they want to go out to get together with a friend to study. And then they go crazy on you saying, when you say no, all my friends are allowed out. By the way, I've yet to meet that friend, okay? I've been in South Africa at times with Rabbi Wein and his Rebbitzin. I spent a wonderful day with your wife going touring, Allah Shalom, when we were in South Africa on our last trip there. Friends not there, not in Australia, not anywhere I've seen, anywhere I've traveled. And the key here is that first time you explain why. Then you tell them, you could ask me 3 more times. 3 more times. First time they ask you, say, okay, great, that's once. No emotion, just say that's once. Get 2 more. You don't give a reason, like my father's story says. Second time, calmly say, okay, that's twice. You get 1 more. Okay, a third time, you say that's 3 times. Okay, that's fine. And they know from your discussions with them ahead of time about this technique that you're going to ignore them the next time. There's a beautiful thought from Rav Henoch Leibowitz, the last Rosh Yeshiva of Chafetz Chaim yeshivas. And he brilliantly says something that actually I know cured at least 3 people of OCD, but I'm using this for a different thing. It's an unbelievable medrash. And think about this, because it's actually very practical. It's an unbelievable medrash where it says that Avram is taking Yitzchak to the Akedah. And Samael, an agent of Satan, stops him and says, "Old man, are you out of your mind? You think you're going to get another shot at having a son?" The medrash tells us. And Avram answers, "Amanas came, even so." And Satan keeps going. But don't you realize when your wife Sarah hears about this, she's going to die of fright and sorrow? And Avram says, Almanas Cain. And Satan keeps going after him. So Rav Henach asks an obvious question. Avram had the best excuse of all time. Best excuse of all time. I'm on a mission from God. God told me to do this. I was told to do this. Why didn't he say that? So Rav Henach answers, because Avram knew that with the Satan, the slightest answer will pull you into the quicksand. So if you start, instead of broken record technique, telling your kids, Almanas Cain, you could blame me. But the equivalent of that, even so, it's the equivalent of the broken record technique. And one final point on this piece is just a general guidance that sometimes one of the most important parenting techniques to think about is the technique of knowing that your children sometimes you have to ignore. There are times that the answer is don't just do something, stand there. Okay, the opposite of common sense. Sometimes you do absolutely nothing. There's this beautiful chazal that talks about no saying makom l'shah. So it talks about, think about the story of 3 giants in our history. Okay? Yaakov, Barach. Yaakov pulled back and ran away from his brother Esav. Strategic withdrawal. Moshe, Barach. Moshe did the same thing. He strategically withdrew. And David, Barach. So Chazal asks, what do we learn from this? So here's the beautiful Chazal. V'chol mi she'omed k'neged hashah nofal biyado. V'chol mi she'nosei makom l'shah hashah nofel biyado. Meaning, it's just a beautiful way of saying, sometimes when you strategically withdraw and you bide your time and you choose your battlegrounds and you pull back, that's when you have the best kind of outcomes. And when you focus on the positive and you bounce back acceptance and belief in your child, that's when you have the best outcomes. You know, there was a recent study about the Soccer World Cup where they found that everybody has a tendency towards action over inaction. It's very hard to do nothing. It's very hard to passively pull back. Very hard to just sit and do nothing. What Chazal are telling us here is not easy. So they found the following. When there is a penalty shot in a World Cup game, talking about huge stakes, the whole world is watching, most goalies should do nothing. The best way of blocking that penalty shot is to stand in the middle and stay in the middle. And that will give you your best shot of blocking the shot, okay? But what the vast majority do, often unsuccessfully, is they leap. They leap to try to block the score. And that is almost invariably a bad time. Sometimes we need wisdom to know how to be nosei makom l'shah. Okay, let me start to come to the end. In this neighborhood, there's the Oliner family. Are there any Oliners here? I'm sure you know some Oliners. It's right from this neighborhood. So, in World War II, in the Holocaust, a young boy, a young Oliner, who ended up having family right here, one day, the Nazis, Yimach Shemam, lined up his entire town. Shot his parents, shot his siblings, shot his neighbors, shot everybody. Killed the entire town. And he managed to wander off in the chaos. He's a little kid. And he comes to a farmhouse and is taken in by a righteous Gentile who save him and protect him throughout the war in remarkable ways. And he's sponsored by the family you know to come here after the war. And he comes here and he dedicates his life to researching what creates a moral giant, what creates a righteous Gentile. And he interviewed, together with his wife, who also got a PhD in sociology as he did, he interviewed everybody he could find, asking them a simple question. How could you do what you did? How could you have done that? You were putting your children at risk. You were putting everybody you knew at risk for being murdered. And he writes, they all had the same reaction. I don't get the question. I don't get the question. So he tried to dig deeper. Why was it so obvious to them? And he found many findings. His books are, to me, wonderful manuals in parenting, the number of books he wrote. But the one that I find most compelling is the way these moral giants handled mistakes. It's all the way they handled mistakes. If you, growing up in that home, made a mistake, which invariably everybody does, when you messed up and violated the moral expectations of that family, the parents wouldn't yell at you. They wouldn't scream at you. You know what they did? They patiently looked you in the eye and they said, we know that you're better than this. We know that you're better than this. We believe in you. Let's talk about a tshuva process. How can you make this right? No anger, no guilt induction, just a very clear message. How are you going to do tshuva? How are you going to do tshuva? How are you going to make it right? What are you going to do? It turns out that ingredient was key to change the setback to feedback. And that kind of an approach to parenting, of taking the chait and not seeing it as a sin, a sign that the child was bad, but seeing it instead, as Tanakh tells us, chait is when, as the archers of Sheva Binyamin, they never miss the mark, lo yachti. Chait is you miss the mark. When you miss the mark, you do it. You have a do-over. You try for it again. You go from threat to challenge. That was the key. Let me end with the following story. But first, let me summarize a little bit what I said until now, because I wasn't really listening that carefully, okay? So number one, we talked about the importance of the lessons, some of the lessons of believing in your child, of expecting the best from them, of somehow understanding that the balance between love and limits is the key. And in fact, that's what all the research on digital responsibility shows us. I'm happy to provide a PowerPoint for you guys to post with some very specific guidelines on digital safety. The work of of Dr. Shapiro is far more, I think, far more comprehensive and research-based, but it's basically all about finding the balance between love and limits, setting limits. It's much easier to do it with your younger kids than with your older kids. It's a talk in and of itself, but it's so important to do that because our kids need it. What they see now in one night, the Sama Rebbe said in 1950 that what his Hasidim saw in one bus ride from Williamsburg to Manhattan was more than their grandparents saw in a lifetime in the shtetl. Just think about what our kids carry in their pocket now. Just think about that. The challenges are unbelievable. We don't have the option of not talking to them and having a dialogue and putting limits that they're going to hate. But that's okay. They're very specific guidelines that I'm happy to share, but I'd recommend going to Dr. Shapiro's for really very effective research-driven recommendations. Number two, we talked about the power of growth through facing challenge, the story of Keith Jarrett. I didn't talk at all about a finding that we find in our research at Azrieli with our doctoral students multiple times, the importance of parents working together. My father would always say, Couples don't have to think alike, they have to think together. And what that's about is we find that when couples don't think together, okay, it is incredibly corrosive in terms of their internalizing the messages of our religion. It's, we did a number of studies, our students, both with children of Baalei Tshuva, but also with children of people from birth. And when parents would fight over religion, it would have the opposite effect of what you'd want. The key is to pull back, no matter how much you disagree. Pull back, say to yourself, not now, and then to quietly discuss it and figure out a way to get on the same page. But the key is to strike when the iron is cold and having a discussion. And then we talked about the importance of chores, the importance of the loser award, right? The importance of time and emotion in shaping values. And I'll end with a story. Any of you hear my homeless story? Maybe not. Or if you did, no. It's not a story I've told that one. You heard it, right? Okay. It's chazara for you. So here's the homeless story. And with this, I'll end. A number of years ago, I was invited to speak at a homeless conference. I was extremely excited because I pictured hanging out with a bunch of homeless people. It was somewhere in Manhattan. And I thought, who could be more interesting than talking to a bunch of homeless people? It wasn't. It was the Waldorf Astoria Ballroom. 400 very well-dressed professionals specializing in homelessness. And I go in, and there were two speakers. I was one of the speakers. But the other speaker on the dais was a very good-looking man, dressed in an amazingly expensive suit. Even though I don't know what an expensive suit looks like, even I could tell. This is a very well-dressed man. And then you read his bio. His bio was incredible. His bio was Dr. So-and-so, has his BA from Harvard, his PhD from Harvard. He's director of homeless policy planning for the United States government. Last year, he won an Oscar award. He won an Oscar for a documentary he made on homelessness. And it's going on and on. I'm thinking, I have to speak. This Tarvadas guy has to speak next to this guy, and I want to go home. And then he gets up. He spoke first. And the first words out of his mouth were so shocking that you almost saw 400 people like collectively faint and fall out of their seat. Here's what his opening line was. He said, when I was 11 years old, in front of me, my father, in a coked up rage, shot my mother and then killed himself. And there's like, oh, how does this jive? He said, I realized that I was about to fall in the hand of the foster care system, and I knew what the problems were in my neighborhood with that. So I run away. I'm an only child, he said. I spent the next 2 years, from 11 to 13, going from homeless shelter to homeless shelter, leading a totally meaningless life. Because the second I thought they were on to me, because I did look older than my age, but they would start to get suspicious, I would run away again. And I had nobody to talk to. He said, you know what it's like to live with that kind of trauma and loneliness and to lose everything you've ever known? He said, until I came to a shelter in Manhattan, where I heard 4 words that forever changed my life. Everybody takes out their pen, 4 words, this is the answer. We're always looking for the answer. The answer. He says, put your pen back in. He said it wasn't the words, it was the way they were spoken. He said, I go into a shelter in Manhattan, and the director comes over to me, he puts his arm around my shoulder, and he looks me in the eye. It's key, in the eye. How are you doing? How are you doing? And I saw, from the way he asked the question, he really wanted to know, and I figured I'd take a risk. I started telling him. And the more I told him, the more I wanted to tell him, and he really listened. Ozen maznayim, ozen, the ear, is tied etymologically to maznayim, scales, the inner ear, the source of balance. It balanced me. He said that I spent the next couple of months pouring my heart out to him, and he was there. He was there for me. And after a couple of months of this, he realized I'm a smart guy. And he gets me a full scholarship to the Dalton School. From there, I get the scholarships to Harvard, and that's why I'm here. So let me end with that message for all of you. As we try to actualize the dream that brought us all into this room tonight, and as we work to benefit from the amazing parenting programs and other services of Madraigos and of this amazing community, and as we try to bridge the wisdom of previous generations into this generation, may we all be zocheh to be able to look our children and our grandchildren in the eye and truly ask them, how are you doing? So we could be there for them and giving them a hug and love and support. Thank you.
We're going to be davening Ma'ariv in the shul if anyone's interested. And if anyone's interested in any of the parenting groups that we offer, feel free to reach out to the office, to the staff at the office. Good evening, everyone.